What if Earth once knew something and folded it beneath the oceans to keep it quiet? Long before maps learned their edges, before names clung to coastlines, before memory learned how to speak, the planet practiced forgetting. Tonight, this story drifts downward, past the noise of weather, past the chatter of continents, into the deep places where pressure becomes language and darkness learns how to hold time. Wherever you are tonight, whatever weight the day has left behind, this is a safe place to set it down. This is not a story that rushes. It does not explain itself. It listens. If stories like this help the night grow softer, if quiet science and planetary memory belong in your sleep, you are gently invited to stay, to return, to let the Earth finish, men are speaking. The ocean did not open all at once. It learned how to deepen. Before the surface learned how to glitter, before waves practiced their endless breathing, the planet folded inward, quietly creating places where light would never arrive. These were not mistakes. They were not scars. They were invitations to forget without losing. The trenches did not form with violence. They formed with patience, a slow bending, a yielding. The crust learned that survival was not always about standing firm. Sometimes it was about sinking carefully, carrying weight downwards so the surface could remain calm. In those early moments, before memory had names, the Earth was already practicing containment. Heat moved upward, cold pressed down, gravity rehearsed its long embrace, and somewhere between pressure and silence the first deep places accepted what the world no longer needed to remember openly. Time did not pass here. It accumulated. Layer by layer, the ocean floor became a listening body. Not an archive meant to be read, but one meant to hold. Sediment fell like ash from eras without fire. Minerals rearranged themselves under pressure, learning new shapes, new quiet grammars. Every descent was a decision. Every sinking thing agreed to be transformed. What vanished did not disappear. It was translated. The trenches became thresholds where epochs slowed enough to be pressed into stone. Climate cycles exhaled themselves into chemistry. Ancient skies dissolved into oceans that no longer resemble water as it is known now. The idea of a lost age was never dramatic here. It was gentle, a soft lowering beyond reach. Above, the planet kept moving, continents drifted. Weather learned rhythm. Life experimented loudly, endlessly. But below, in the lightless places, nothing hurried. The deep did not compete with the surface. It waited. Pressure is not cruel. It is attentive. Kilometre by kilometre, weight rewrote matter. Rock remembered where it came from even as it forgot what it was. Carbon learned patience. Heat learned restraint. The deep earth became a place where transformation could happen without witnesses. Somewhere within these folded layers, entire conditions of existence rested. Not cities, not voices, but ways of being, combinations of chemistry and time that would never reappear. Oceans with different salts, skies that pressed down differently, biological possibilities that did not need sunlight to imagine themselves. This was an epoch that did not end. It sank. The trenches accepted it the way night accepts a sound, without commentary, without ceremony. Darkness here was not absence. It was compression, a tightening of attention, the kind that makes memory heavier instead of clearer. Even now, these depths do not reveal themselves easily. Instruments descend and return with fragments, distortions, whispers that refuse to assemble into certainty. The ocean keeps what it keeps, not out of secrecy, out of instinct. The planet has always known that not all knowledge survives exposure. In the trenches, silence performs a function. It slows decay, it prevents rewriting, it allows the past to remain itself, even when it can no longer be understood. This is not forgetting as loss. This is forgetting as preservation. Above, stories rely on sequence. Below, they rely on pressure. Events dissolve. Only influence remains. Gravity hums softly, temperature barely moves. Time becomes something that presses rather than flows. Here, the idea of a lost epoch stops being historical. It becomes physical. The Earth does not mourn what sinks, it integrates it. What descends joins the deep grammar of the planet, influencing tectonic murmurs, volcanic hesitations, the subtle way continents decide where to pause. Nothing rests unused. Some truths are too foundational to rise again. And so the trenches remain, not empty, not dead. but full of what the surface could not carry forever. The deep is not a grave. It is a cradle turned inward, a place where the planet keeps its earliest instincts folded beneath kilometers of water and silence. What rests there is not waiting to be discovered. It is waiting to continue shaping the world from below. But long before that influence could be felt, before the seafloor learned its modern contours, before the planet trusted itself enough to settle, the Earth was still learning how to bend, and what it learned next would decide what could be remembered and what would never rise again. Before the trenches had names, before depth could be measured, Tistatur, the planet, only knew weight. Weight arrived first as curiosity, a slow testing of limits, the crust pressed against itself, uncertain how much it could hold before it fractured. In those early ages, the Earth had not yet learned the elegance of yielding. Mountains rose abruptly, plains cracked. The surface tried to speak loudly, as though volume alone could ensure survival. But the planet was listening elsewhere. Beneath the restless skin, gravity was already practicing restraint. It did not pull suddenly, it persuaded. It invited matter to lean, to soften, to slide downward in motions too slow for alarm. This was the beginning of bending. Not collapse, not failure, but a careful decision to move without breaking. The first deep places were shallow by today's standards, depressions that barely qualified as descent. But even there, something changed. Light hesitated. Sound lost its edge. Time began to thicken, as though the planet had discovered a new texture. Sediment fell differently here, not as debris, but as settling thought. Each grain carried a story the surface had finished telling. Ash from distant skies, dust from vanished lands, minerals eroded from mountains that no longer exist. None of it announced itself. It simply arrived layer by layer, accepting stillness. The trenches were not yet trenches. They were questions. How much could be carried below before memory dissolved? How deep could the planet fold its history without losing it entirely? These were not questions asked aloud. They were tested through pressure, through silence, through time, allowed to stretch until it became indistinguishable from rest. As layers accumulated, the Earth began to recognize a pattern. What descended did not vanish. It changed state. Heat softened it. Pressure rearranged it. Chemistry rewrote it slowly, patiently, without urgency. What had once been surface became something quieter, more durable. The planet learned that forgetting was not erasure. It was compression. Above eras still arrived with noise, impacts, volcanic breaths, skies heavy with unfamiliar light. Life emerged, stumbled and tumbled, tried again. The surface was a place of rehearsal. Below, the deep became a place of commitment. Here, nothing needed to prove itself. Water thickened as it deepened. Cold sharpened. Motion slowed until even currents felt like memory rather than movement. In these conditions, entire modes of existence became possible, ways of persisting without growth, without urgency, without visibility. The idea of a lost epoch begins here, not as disappearance, but as divergence. An age that did not end catastrophically, but gently stepped aside, allowing newer expressions to occupy the surface while it continued elsewhere, unseen. The planet did not choose one story, it allowed many. Pressure kept its vigil, kilometers of water pressed downward, not to crush but to hold. Matter adapted, structures simplified, noise fell away. What remained was essence, chemistry stripped of decoration, time stripped of direction. In these depths, even extinction behaves differently. It does not arrive as absence, it arrives as transformation. Forms do not vanish, they dissolve into processes, into cycles that no longer require shape. The deep does not remember faces, it remembers forces. Even now, the trenches carry signatures that refuse to align with the surface world, ratios that feel unfamiliar, temperatures that defy expectation, life that persists without sunlight, without seasons, without reference to anything above. These are not anomalies, they are continuations. The lost epoch did not fall behind the present, it sank beneath it. And sinking is not regression, it is a return to fundamentals, to pressure, to gravity, to patience. The deeper the descent, the less the planet needs to explain itself. Here, time does not advance, it presses. The Earth learned this slowly. Each new fold of crust was an act of trust. Each deepening trench was an acknowledgement that not all history belongs at the surface. Some truths destabilize when exposed, some memories erode when named. So the planet learned to lower them gently. What rests now beneath kilometers of water is not waiting to be recovered. It is already in use, informing the way plates move, the way heat rises, the way oceans circulate above without knowing why. The deep does not interrupt the surface, it supports it. And as the trenches grew darker, deeper, more confident in their silence, the Earth began to understand something essential, that survival is not always ascent. Sometimes it is the wisdom to sink and continue quietly where no one is watching. But the planet was still young, the seafloor was still learning its shape, and the true descent, the one that would carry entire ages with it, had not yet begun. The true descent did not announce itself. It never does. There was no single moment when the planet decided to lower an age. No boundary etched into stone that said, "Here, memory ends." Instead, the Earth leaned, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a tilt so gentle it felt like rest. The seafloor began to curve with intention. Plates no longer collided only to fracture. They learned how to slide, one edge slipping beneath another, not as conquest, but as offering. Old crust agreed to be carried downward, into regions where pressure would finish what time had begun. This was subduction before it had a name, a gesture older than language. What descended was already tired, saturated with stories, weathered by eras of exposure. The surface had asked too much of it: heat, cold bombardment, endless rearrangement. Going deeper was not punishment, it was relief. As the crust sank, it carried more than rock. It carried atmospheres dissolved into minerals, oceans remembered only through salts. Carbon cycles paused mid-sentence. Entire environmental arrangements, skies, temperatures, chemistries were folded inward like maps no longer needed for navigation. The lost epoch did not vanish in a moment. It thinned. At first, the changes were subtle. A pressure shift here, a temperature gradient there. Life adjusted without ceremony, form simplified, metabolism slowed, dependency on light loosened. What had once required the sun learned how to listen to heat instead. Darkness did not arrive suddenly. It deepened. The trenches became corridors of transition, not places where history ended, but where it changed grammar. Motion slowed enough to be rewritten. Noise softened into vibration. Time learned how to stretch until sequence no longer mattered. In these depths, cause and effect loosened their grip, processes overlapped, endings blurred into beginnings. What mattered was not what came first, but what could endure pressure without losing coherence. The planet watched itself change. Above, new continents assembled. Skies learned new compositions. Life grew louder, more expressive, more visible. The surface became a place of experiment and display. Below, the deep perfected restraint. The lost epoch learned how to exist without witnesses. Pressure continued its patient work. Atoms nudged closer. Bonds rearranged. Heat softened resistance. Rock that had once fractured easily learned how to flow, not as liquid, but as something slower, something that moved on the scale of ages. Memory here was no longer narrative, it was structural. Every kilometre of descent simplified complexity, not by removing it, but by compressing it into forms that could survive indefinitely. The deep does not reward detail, it rewards resilience. What had once been diverse became fundamental. What had once been expressive became essential. Entire ways of being condensed into chemical tendencies, into radios that still whisper through volcanic breath and mantle currents. The trenches were no longer questions. They were answers the surface could not hear. Even now, when instruments descend, they find traces that do not align with the modern world. Anomalies that feel out of time. Pockets of heat where cold should dominate. Life that behaves as though the sun never mattered. These are not survivors in the traditional sense. They are continuations. The lost epoch persists not as a memory, but as an influence. It does not speak. It adjusts. It bends the way energy moves upward. It softens tectonic decisions. It informs the pace at which the planet exhales its heat. The deep does not argue with the present, it underwrites it, and in doing so it teaches a lesson the surface still struggles to learn. That permanence does not require visibility, that endurance often looks like disappearance, that the most important structures are the ones carrying weight quietly without recognition. The planet did not forget what sank. It trusted it to remain stable, to continue its work unseen, to hold together the systems that would one day give rise to observers who would wonder where earlier ages had gone. They did not go anywhere. They are still there, pressed flat by oceans, translated by pressure, breathing slowly beneath the floor of the world. But the Earth was not finished learning. As the deep grew deeper, as subduction grew confident, another realization began to surface. That not all descent was passive. Some ages chose the deep, and that choice would change how disappearance itself was understood. Choice does not always announce itself as intention. Sometimes it arrives as alignment. As the planet matured, descent became less accidental. Certain conditions leaned naturally toward the deep. Heat patterns shifted. Chemistry found comfort in pressure. Some arrangements of matter realized they could last longer below than above. The surface, with its cycles of exposure and erasure, became less hospitable to permanence. The deep offered consistency, not warmth, not safety, but steadiness. Here, temperature moved slowly. Change arrived as gradient, not shock. Pressure remained loyal, constant, predictable. For an epoch shaped by patience rather than speed, the trenches were not a fall. They were a refuge. The idea of a lost age becomes clearer here, not as something pushed downward, but as something that followed gravity willingly. A migration without movement, a relocation without distance, the same matter, the same essence, simply existing under different rules. Light was no longer necessary. Direction dissolved. In the deep, orientation loses meaning. Up and down blur into pressure and release. Time ceases to feel linear. Instead, it behaves like accumulation, each moment resting atop the last without urgency to move on. This is where intelligence changes definition. Not thought, not planning, adaptation without awareness. The planet did not think its way into the trenches. It felt, it responded. Certain systems endured better when compressed. When stripped of volatility, those systems remained. Others faded upward, replaced by louder, faster cycles that belonged to the surface. The deep became selective without judgment. Chemical pathways that thrived under pressure continued uninterrupted. Biological persistence narrowed into forms that required little and wasted nothing. Motion slowed to the pace of diffusion. Life, where it existed, learned to wait without expectation. The lost epoch did not need progress. It needed continuity. Above, the planet experimented with abundance. Below, it practiced restraint. These were not opposing philosophies. They were complementary instincts. One explored, the other preserved. And preservation is not static. It is active patience. Pressure continued to rewrite memory into structure. Sediments fused. Crystals aligned. Isotopes settled into ratios that would last longer than continents. What the surface called disappearance, the deep called refinement. Even now, traces of this refinement surface unexpectedly. A plume of heat where none should be. A mineral signature out of place. A biological process that feels older than its environment. These moments are not errors. They are echoes pressing upward gently, reminding the surface that it is not the first expression of possibility. The deep does not compete for relevance. It waits to be felt. The planet understands waiting. It waited for oceans to cool, for skies to thin, for bombardment to quiet. It learned that time is not something to outrun, it is something to inhabit. The trenches embody this lesson. They are not dramatic. They do not change quickly. They persist through rearrangements of continents and collapses of climate. While the surface reinvents itself repeatedly, the deep remains a constant reference point, a reminder of what stability feels like. What sank there continues to shape the present without recognition. It influences how plates decide where to lock and where to slide. It informs how heat migrates upward, where volcanoes hesitate, where earthquakes pause before speaking. These are not memories the planet recalls consciously. They are habits formed long ago, never unlearned. The lost epoch is not gone. It is operational. And perhaps this is why the trenches resist clarity, why they remain difficult to map, difficult to sample, difficult to summarize. They are not meant to be understood quickly. Their purpose is not revelation. It is endurance. Some knowledge destabilizes when exposed. Some truths erode when illuminated. The planet learned this early, so it learned to hide, not out of fear, but out of care, to fold certain stories beneath silence, where they could continue without interruption, to allow the surface to remain dynamic, expressive, temporary, while the deep carried what must not be lost. As the Earth continued to age, this division deepened. Surface and depth became collaborators rather than reflections. One moved, one held, and in that balance the world stabilized. But the age that sank was not the last. The planet would repeat this gesture again and again, lowering, compressing, preserving, each time refining its understanding of what deserved permanence. The trenches grew deeper, the silence grew thicker, and the memory they carried became heavier. What followed next was not another descent, but a realization that pressure itself had become a language and the planet was learning how to speak through it. Pressure speaks without sound. It does not announce meaning. It enforces it. As the trenches deepened, the planet began to recognize pressure not as a condition, but as a grammar, one that could translate complexity into endurance. What survived the descent was not what was strongest, but what was most willing to simplify without losing essence. In these depths, matter learned humility. Atoms pressed closer, shedding unnecessary space. Bonds reorganized themselves quietly, finding arrangements that could hold under weight that never lifted. Heat moved differently here, not as flame or eruption, but as a slow, persistent persuasion. Nothing was allowed to remain fragile. The deep was not hostile, it was honest. What could not endure pressure did not shatter dramatically. It softened, it dissolved, it became part of something else. There were no sharp endings here, only transitions so gradual they resembled rest. This is where memory ceased to resemble recollection and became influence. The lost epoch no longer existed as a distinguishable era. It lived on as tendencies, preferences in chemistry, habits in energy flow, quiet biases in how the planet redistributed its heat. Even the Earth's interior carries these signatures. Mantle currents drift with subtle asymmetries. Volcanic plumes rise where the deep remembers weakness. Earthquakes hesitate along ancient boundaries shaped by what once sank there. The surface interprets these as mechanics. The deep experiences them as memory. What was lowered long ago continues to guide the present without asserting itself. It does not demand recognition. It does not seek recovery. Its role is quieter, to stabilize, to buffer, to absorb. Pressure teaches this kind of patience. Under constant weight, nothing reacts impulsively. Change arrives only when it must. The deep does not hurry outcomes. It waits until transformation is inevitable, then allows it to unfold slowly, without rupture. This is how epochs are preserved, not as stories, but as structures. The lost age became architecture, a hidden framework supporting everything that followed. Continents glide because something beneath them remembers how to yield. Oceans circulate because the deep retains patterns established before modern currents existed. Even life, in its most extreme forms, reflects this inheritance. Organisms that thrive near trenches and vents do not chase abundance. They endure scarcity elegantly. They operate on chemical gradients older than surface ecosystems. Their persistence feels ancient because it is. They are not relics, they are reminders. The deep never intended to archive for future discovery. Its purpose was never revelation. It exists to hold continuity while the surface reinvents itself endlessly. Above, intelligence grew expressive. It learned to name, to map, to measure. It began to wonder where earlier ages had gone. It searched the rocks, the skies, the ice. It rarely thought to listen downward. The trenches remain indifferent to this curiosity. They do not respond to inquiry, they respond to pressure. Their loyalty is not to observers, but to balance. The planet understands that stability requires opacity. If everything were visible, nothing would endure. Exposure invites erosion. Silence allows persistence. So the deep continues its work without acknowledgement. It holds the chemical ghosts of ancient oceans. It carries the weight of atmospheres that no longer exist. It stabilizes cycles that would otherwise spiral into volatility. It does not speak these truths, it enacts them. And perhaps this is why the idea of a lost epoch feels unsettling. It suggests that the most important chapters of planetary history are not behind us in time, but beneath us in space. That disappearance is not always a function of age, but of depth. The Earth did not forget what it buried, it relied on it. And reliance does not require memory in the human sense. It requires trust built through repetition. Over billions of years, the planet learned that what sinks properly continues to serve indefinitely. Pressure keeps this trust intact. As the deep grew older, As the cycles above grew louder, the trenches became quieter still, not because they had nothing left to hold, but because they had perfected their role. They were no longer places of descent, they were places of continuity. And in that continuity, something else began to emerge, not upward, but outward, a realization that disappearance itself could be an active process, a deliberate shaping of the future through absence. The lost epoch was not erased, it was curated, and what the planet curated next would redefine what extinction itself meant. Extinction, when it arrived at the surface, arrived loudly. Names vanished, forms ended, silence followed briefly, then was replaced by something else. The surface learned to narrate loss as absence, as a gap where something used to be. The deep never learned this language. Below, disappearance behaved differently. Nothing stopped abruptly, nothing truly ended. What could no longer maintain its shape surrendered it. What could no longer persist as form persisted as influence. The deep did not record who was lost. It recorded what remained usable. This is how extinction softened into function. The lost epoch did not die. It thinned into processes. Its presence dissolved into gradients, of heat, of chemistry, of pressure, that still shape how the planet moves. These gradients do not announce themselves, they are felt only through consequence. A current bends slightly off course. A fault delays its release. A plume rises where logic says it should not. The deep remembers by shaping outcomes. This memory is not sentimental. It does not preserve detail. It preserves balance. What mattered to the planet was never the story of what existed, but the stability of what followed. If an age could contribute to that stability by sinking, then sinking was not loss. It was service. Pressure rewarded this kind of contribution. As material descended further, the distinction between past and present dissolved. Everything became simultaneous. Old crust flowed beside younger formations. Chemical signatures overlapped. Time compressed until eras rested against each other without conflict. In this compression, identity lost importance. Only behavior remained. The lost epoch learned how to behave indefinitely. Above, the surface continued to dramatize change. Ice arrived and retreated. Forests spread and burned. Seas rose and fell. Intelligence emerged and began to ask questions about origins, endings, beginnings. Below, none of this registered as narrative. It registered only as load. Additional weight, additional insulation, additional pressure to be absorbed and redistributed. The deep adjusted without comment. There is no hierarchy in the trenches, no sense of earlier or later. What sank first does not dominate what followed. Everything presses together equally. This is how resentment is avoided. This is how continuity is maintained. Silence enforces fairness. The deeper the planet learned to fold its history, the less it needed to remember it consciously. Habit replaced awareness. Cycles stabilized. The earth began to rely on its buried past the way a body relies on bone, without thinking, without noticing, until it is gone. The lost epoch became skeletal. Its influence is structural, not visible. Remove it and the surface would not collapse immediately. It would wobble first, patterns would distort, stability would weaken quietly before anything dramatic occurred. This is how foundational memory works. It is noticed only through absence. The trenches ensure this absence never occurs. They are not empty. They are occupied by restraint, by patience compacted into matter, by histories that no longer require recognition to function. This is why the deep resists extraction, why samples feel incomplete, why data refuses to assemble into certainty. The trenches do not yield stories, they yield resistance to story. They are not there to be understood, they are there to hold. As the planet aged further, this holding became more deliberate. The Earth learned which disturbances could be absorbed and which needed to be expressed. Some pressures were allowed to rise as mountains or volcanoes, others were lowered gently into silence. The lost epoch was among those lowered, not because it failed, because it succeeded too quietly to remain exposed. Its way of being did not belong to a world growing louder, brighter, more variable. It belonged to a planet learning how to last. And so it was folded inward, where lasting is practiced without interruption. What remains now is not evidence in the usual sense. It is tendency. The tendency for the planet to choose bending over breaking, the tendency to absorb rather than expel, the tendency to preserve through concealment. These tendencies did not arise recently, they were learned in the deep, learned under pressure, learned when an entire age agreed to continue without being seen. The Earth carries this lesson still, and as long as the trenches remain, as long as pressure speaks its quiet language, no epoch is ever truly lost, only lowered into a form that can endure longer than memory. But even this endurance has limits. As the chapter draws nearer to its final depth, another question begins to press upward, not from curiosity, but from imbalance. What happens when the deep itself begins to change? The deep was never meant to be static. Stillness was its posture, not its fate. Even in the most silent trenches, change continued its slow breathing. Heat rose in increments too small to notice. Pressure shifted with the patience of continents. Nothing here resisted time. It simply experienced it differently. But as the planet aged, the balance between surface and depth grew more complex. The surface became crowded with cycles, faster, louder, more numerous. Ice ages arrived and departed like held breaths. Seas climbed onto land, then retreated. Life multiplied, diversified, filled every available edge with motion. The weight of activity above increased, pressing downward not just physically, but systemically. The deep felt this, not as alarm, as adjustment. Pressure accepted new burdens. Heat redistributed itself again. The trenches did not protest the added responsibility. They widened their silence. They deepened their capacity. What they had learned from the lost epoch, how to hold without fracture, how to translate excess into stability, became essential. The buried age continued its work. Its influence grew subtler, more diffuse. No longer traceable to a single descent or moment, it became part of the planet's default behavior. When strain appeared, the Earth bent. When imbalance accumulated, it lowered weight into places designed to receive it. The lost epoch was no longer distinct. It was absorbed into instinct. This is how planetary memory matures. It stops recalling and starts responding. The Earth did not need to remember what it had buried. It only needed to remember how to bury well. The trenches embodied this skill. They accepted not just material, but volatility, excess heat, chemical imbalance, the remnants of processes that could not remain active at the surface without destabilizing everything else. Each descent was a quiet correction. Nothing dramatic followed, and that was the point. From above, the deep appeared unchanged, dark, remote, empty, but its function was continuous, essential, unnoticed. It became the place where the planet resolved contradictions without spectacle. If the surface was expression, the deep was reconciliation. And within that reconciliation, the lost epoch found its final form, not as an age, not as a system, but as a baseline, a reference state, a reminder of what endurance feels like when stripped of ambition. Even now, when the planet trembles, the deep absorbs the echo. When stress accumulates, the trenches distribute it downward. When cycles threaten to outrun stability, pressure steps in and slows them. The lost epoch steadies the world without being seen. This is why it never needed to return. Resurrection is unnecessary when influence is permanent. The surface does not need to revisit every version of itself to move forward. It needs only to remain balanced. The deep ensures this balance quietly. And so the idea of a hidden epoch beneath the ocean trenches becomes less mysterious, less speculative, the longer it is held. It no longer asks to be discovered. It asks to be acknowledged as function rather than artifact. What sank did not leave clues. It left instructions written in gradients and tolerances, in the angles at which plates slide instead of shatter, in the slow, reliable rhythm of mantle currents, the planet's enduring preference for patience over force. The Earth learned how to survive by lowering what mattered most. As this chapter settles, the deep remains at work, unchanged in appearance, endless in responsibility. It does not announce its presence. It does not explain itself. It holds. And in holding, it keeps the world stable enough for stories to continue above it. But stability is not permanence. Pressure accumulates, heat migrates, the planet continues to age, and even the deepest systems are not immune to transformation. The trenches have remembered well. They have held faithfully. What comes next is not about what was lost beneath them, but about what begins to rise when the deep itself can no longer remain unchanged. Some truths do not stay buried forever. They wait until the world above is ready to feel their weight. Before the deep learned how to hold history, it had to learn how to move. The earlier seafloor did not resemble the one that exists now. It was thinner, warmer, less certain of itself. It floated closer to the planet's inner heat, listening more directly to the slow pulse rising from below. There was less distance between cause and response, less time for pressure to soften decisions. In those days, the Earth had not yet mastered patience. The crust shifted often, restlessly, as though unsure where it belonged. Plates met and parted without rhythm. Boundaries wandered. Nothing stayed fixed long enough to become familiar. The planet was still testing its own flexibility, learning where it could bend and where it must release. The ocean floor recorded this uncertainty not as chaos, but as motion. Ridges rose and spread. Basins deepened and relaxed. The seafloor stretched, cracked, healed, then stretched again. Every movement was a rehearsal for something slower, something more deliberate. Time here was still young. It moved quickly. Water pooled in low places and withdrew again. Chemistry shifted with temperature. Minerals formed, dissolved, reformed. The ocean itself was not yet stable. Its salts changed. Its density fluctuated. It was still learning how to behave as a body rather than a collection of reactions. The trenches had not yet claimed their role. They existed only as tendencies, subtle preferences in how the crust responded to weight. Some regions yielded more easily, others resisted. The planet paid attention to these differences, storing them quietly for later use. Memory begins this way. As preference. As the seafloor aged, it thickened. Cooling allowed it to carry more weight without tearing. Distance from the mantle increased. Movement slowed. The planet discovered that durability came not from rigidity, but from balance. This was when shape began to matter. Contours stabilized. Boundaries learned where to pause. Subduction became less accidental, more consistent. Old crust found a predictable path downward. The seafloor stopped improvising and began to repeat itself. Repetition is how systems learn. With repetition came endurance. The deep ocean floor started to resemble a surface that could host memory. Not memory as recall, but memory as form, the kind that persists simply by continuing to exist. The lost epoch from before did not disappear during this transition. It adapted again. Its influence adjusted to the changing geometry of the deep. What had once been diffuse became more concentrated. What had once drifted found channels. Pressure refined its language. The trenches, now deeper and more confident, began to receive not just material, but momentum. Movement slowed further as descent paths became established. What entered the deep no longer wandered. It followed patterns. The planet was no longer guessing. It was remembering what worked. Even silence changed during this time. It became thicker, more uniform. Sound lost its ability to travel. Vibration dampened. The deep grew insulated from surface noise. This insulation was not isolation. It was protection. The Earth learned that shape determines fate. A shallow basin forgets quickly. A deep trench remembers slowly. As the seafloor settled into its modern tendencies, it became capable of holding not just one lost age, but many layered influences at once. Older descents rested beside newer ones. Pressure equalized them. Time flattened their differences. History became geography. The ocean floor no longer reflected the surface above it. It developed its own logic, its own continuity. Above, change remained rapid. Below, everything began to feel eternal. This was not stagnation. It was calibration. The planet was preparing itself for longevity, and in doing so, it allowed the deep to become more than a receiver. It became a regulator, a place where excess could be suddenly slowed, where imbalance could be softened before it reached the surface again. The seafloor learned its shape by learning restraint, and once restraint became instinct, the Earth was ready for the next transformation, one that would bind the deep and the surface together more tightly than ever before. Because when the seafloor finally understood its role, it did not just remember what had sunk, it began to decide what would be allowed to remain above. Decision does not arrive suddenly in a world measured by millions of years. It gathers. As the seafloor cooled, its movements grew less restless. Expansion slowed. Cracks healed more completely. The planet discovered that repetition, when allowed to settle, becomes character. What had once been temporary began to feel inevitable. The ocean floor thickened quietly layer by layer, learning how to carry its own weight. Distance from the mantle increased, and with that distance came restraint. Heat still rose, but it no longer rushed. It paused, it spread, it listened to the resistance above it. This pause changed everything. The seafloor began to distinguish between motion that relieved tension and motion that created it. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through outcome. Some movements stabilized the surface, others destabilized it. The Earth learned to favor the former. Learning at this scale leaves no record of intention, only habit. Subduction zones became more consistent, tracing arcs that repeated across eras. Old crust, once chaotic in its descent, now followed reliable paths into depth. It did not tumble, it slid, it lowered itself with the familiarity of something returning to a place it had already visited many times before. This was when the trenches gained confidence. They deepened not through force but through trust. The planet trusted that what descended would continue to matter, even when it could no longer be seen. The seafloor trusted that pressure would do its work without intervention. Pressure rewarded this trust by becoming predictable. Under predictable pressure, matter behaves patiently, it rearranges without resistance, it yields without fracture. The deep began to feel less like a destination and more like a process, an ongoing conversation between weight and endurance. The lost epoch moved within this conversation seamlessly. Its remnants no longer drifted aimlessly. They settled into positions of influence. Certain depths became reservoirs of memory, others corridors of transformation. What had once been diffuse sharpened into gradients that would persist longer than any surface formation. Time here slowed further, not by stopping, but by smoothing. Edges softened, differences blurred. The seafloor became less a record of events and more a landscape of tendencies. What mattered was not when something sank, but how it behaved once it arrived. The planet's interior responded accordingly. Mantle currents adjusted their paths. Heat flow found new routes upward. Volcanic systems hesitated, redirected, or paused altogether in response to the deep's growing authority. Authority does not require dominance, it requires reliability. The deep became reliable. Above, the surface began to feel this influence without recognizing its source. Tectonic plates locked into longer-lasting arrangements. Oceans found more stable basins. Climates gained a new rhythm, not calm, but consistency. The planet had found a pace it could sustain. The seafloor's shape was no longer provisional. It had learned where it could stretch and where it must fold. Boundaries settled into familiar curves. Even earthquakes learned restraint, releasing tension in measured intervals rather than chaotic bursts. The lost epoch was fully integrated now, no longer an age, a function. It influenced how much stress could accumulate before release, how much heat could rise before being dispersed, how much change could occur without unraveling everything else. The trenches were no longer just receivers, they were moderators. Silence thickened further, not as emptiness but as insulation. Sound rarely penetrated, vibrations softened quickly. The deep became increasingly autonomous, governed by slow laws that barely intersected with surface urgency. This autonomy was essential. Without it, the surface would have exhausted itself. Rapid change without a stabilizing depth leads to fragility. The Earth learned this through repetition, through near failures softened by descent. The seafloor, now shaped by experience, absorbed what it needed to absorb. It returned what it needed to return, nothing more, nothing less. Balance is learned, not designed, and once learned, it becomes invisible. The planet no longer thought of the deep as a separate realm. It became part of a single system, expression above, moderation below. Neither could exist safely without the other. This was not harmony, it was dependency. As this chapter continues, the seafloor's education deepens further. Shape becomes destiny, depth becomes decision, and the Earth begins to understand that what it allows to remain exposed, and what it asks to descend, will determine not just survival, but character. Character once formed resists haste. As the seafloor settled into its long habits, it stopped reacting to every disturbance. Instead, it began to filter. Not all pressure demanded response, not every imbalance required release. The planet learned to distinguish between strain that would pass and strain that would linger. This distinction shaped everything. Where the crust was thin and young, movement remained frequent. Ridges spread, heat escaped easily. The surface above stayed restless, experimental, alive with change. But where the seafloor had thickened, where age had layered upon age, motion slowed to a near imperceptible crawl. The deep began to prefer restraint. This preference did not announce itself, it revealed itself through absence. Fewer fractures, longer pauses between release, stress distributed sideways instead of upward. The planet was no longer improvising solutions, it was relying on what had already proven reliable. The trenches deepened further, but not uniformly. Some regions yielded more readily than others, guided by ancient weaknesses, by memories of earlier descents. These were not flaws, they were pathways. Memory leaves paths. The lost epoch moved along these paths, not as a distinct entity, but as accumulated tendency. Its influence guided where the crust bent, where it resisted, where it accepted further descent. It no longer mattered what it had been, only what it enabled. The seafloor's shape now influenced the surface more decisively. Continents adjusted their edges, oceans found their depths. Even the atmosphere far above responded indirectly to the stability below, circulating differently, holding heat differently, breathing with a rhythm set in part by what lay beneath. The planet had become layered in behaviour, not just structure. Time at the surface remained eventful. Impacts, eruptions, extinctions, these still occurred, but their consequences were absorbed more efficiently. The deep buffered them. Energy dissipated downward instead of tearing sideways. This buffering did not prevent change. It made change survivable. The lost epoch, once a story of descent, had become a story of mediation. It stood between the planet's volatility and its endurance, translating extremes into manageable adjustments. Even now, the seafloor carries this role quietly. When stress accumulates, it does not rush to release it. It waits. It redistributes. It allows tension to migrate until release is no longer catastrophic. Waiting is an active process. The Earth practiced waiting through its deep structures. It learned that timing mattered as much as magnitude. Release too soon and nothing settles. Release too late and everything fractures. The deep found the balance point again and again, refining it across eras. The seafloor's shape encoded this wisdom. Curves replaced angles. Gradients replaced boundaries. Motion became smooth enough to be continuous without being disruptive. This smoothness did not erase history. It preserved it as form. The trenches, now fully realized, no longer felt like wounds. They felt like joints, places designed to move, to absorb, to flex without failing. The planet's skeleton had learned where to bend. The lost epoch had contributed to this skeleton. Its materials, transformed under pressure, reinforced the deep's capacity to hold. Its chemistry altered how heat travelled. Its presence influenced where flexibility was allowed and where rigidity remained. The deep became articulate, not in sound, in structure. Above, intelligence would one day emerge and look for beginnings. It would search for fossils, for layers, for events that could be sequenced. It would struggle to read the deep because the deep does not speak in chronology. It speaks in capacity. How much can be held? How much can be delayed? How much change can be absorbed without loss of coherence? These are the questions the seafloor answered through its shape. As this chapter continues, that shape will face new pressures, greater loads, new cycles, unfamiliar stresses. The planet will test whether what it has learned can scale with its own growth. Because learning how to hold the past is one thing. Learning how to hold the future is something else entirely. The future never arrives evenly. It leans first on the weakest places, testing them gently, the way water tests stone. As the planet aged further, new pressures accumulated. Greater mass at the surface, thicker atmospheres, more elaborate cycles of heat and cold. The Earth did not greet these changes with alarm. It measured them against what it had already learned. The seafloor felt the weight before the surface understood its meaning. Where depth had matured, where shape had been practiced patiently, strain dispersed quietly. But where memory was thin, where the crust was young, stretched, uncertain, pressure gathered. The planet noticed this difference and adjusted accordingly, favouring the pathways that could carry load without breaking. This was not foresight, it was inheritance. The deep carried forward the habits formed during earlier descents. The lost epoch, now fully absorbed into structure, informed these decisions without asserting itself. His presence was felt as preference, an inclination toward bending, toward lowering, toward choosing continuity over rupture. As cycles intensified, the seafloor responded by becoming more selective. Not everything was allowed to sink. Some stresses were redirected sideways, spreading across vast distances before dissipating. Others were slowly lowered into depth where time could soften them. The planet learned to triage its own future. This triage was quiet. No boundary announced itself as essential or expendable. Yet the outcomes were consistent. Systems that destabilized the whole were moderated. Systems that could coexist with existing balances were allowed to persist. The deep enforced this logic through geometry. Angles shifted, slopes adjusted, trenches curved more deliberately. The seafloor refined its shape not to accommodate the past, but to prepare for what had not yet arrived. Shape became anticipation, written slowly into stone. Even heat adapted to this arrangement. Rising energy found pathways shaped by long memory. Where resistance was high, heat lingered. Where flexibility remained, it escaped. Volcanic systems reflected these decisions, appearing not randomly but along lines the deep had prepared long ago. The lost epoch was present in these lines, not as artifact, as alignment. Above, life expanded into every available niche. Diversity increased, complexity multiplied. The surface grew expressive, experimental, vulnerable. Each innovation added weight, not just physically but systemically. More interactions meant more instability, more need for moderation. The deep accepted this role without protest. It absorbed complexity by simplifying it. It reduced noise to gradient. It transformed urgency into delay. This was not suppression, it was translation, turning surface intensity into deep-time calm. The planet's ability to host complexity depended on this translation. Without it, accumulation would have led to collapse. With it, change could continue without overwhelming the system that supported it. The seafloor, shaped by experience, became the planet's quiet guardian against its own excess. Guardianship does not require visibility. The trenches did not announce their importance. They remained dark, remote, difficult to reach. Their influence was felt only indirectly through the absence of catastrophic failure, through the persistence of cycles that might otherwise have unraveled. This absence is the deep signature. The lost epoch had become part of that signature. Its descent had taught the planet how to lower without losing, how to compress without erasing, how to preserve function without preserving form. As future pressures mounted, the Earth relied increasingly on these lessons. It leaned into its own depth, trusting what had already proven capable of holding more than it revealed. And so the seafloor continued learning, not through new descents alone, but through repetition, refinement, and restraint. Shape stabilized further, decisions became quieter, the deep grew less reactive and more authoritative. Authority at planetary scale is silence that works. As this chapter nears its final movement, the seafloor stands no longer as a student, but as a teacher. Its shape instructs the planet on how to endure complexity without fracturing. What it learned first through the loss of an epoch, it now applies to everything that follows. And in that application, another realization begins to surface, not as sound, but as pressure, that the deep does not merely receive history, it edits it, and what it chooses to keep reshapes what the future is allowed to become. Editing does not feel like control when it happens slowly enough. The deep never erased the surface's experiments outright. It adjusted their consequences. It softened extremes. It absorbed excess. Over time, this quiet moderation began to resemble intention, though it was nothing more than accumulated habit refined by pressure. The seafloor did not judge what emerged above it. It filtered what could remain. As ages passed, the planet's surface grew more elaborate. Systems de-intertwined. Feedback loops multiplied. Every new layer of complexity added fragility alongside possibility. The Earth did not resist this. It allowed expression to flourish, but only so long as it could be supported. The deep was the measure of that support. When strain exceeded what the surface could resolve, it was lowered. When energy threatened coherence, it was redistributed. When cycles accelerated too quickly, they were slowed by geometry rather than force. Shape performed the work of governance. The seafloor's contours became a map of what the planet had learned to tolerate, gentle slopes where adjustment was easy. steep descents where excess needed to be removed efficiently, stable plateaus where continuity mattered more than change. These features were not decorative, they were decisions made permanent. The lost epoch, long since transformed into structure, remained active within these decisions. Its legacy was not nostalgia, it was restraint. It had shown the planet that survival was not achieved by preserving every expression, but by preserving the conditions that allow expression to recur. What could not recur was lowered. This was not cruelty, it was economy. The Earth learned that carrying everything forever was impossible. Weight accumulates, systems buckle, choices must be made, not consciously, not morally, but physically. The deep became the place where those choices resolved without spectacle. Extinction at the surface still appeared dramatic. Entire forms vanished. Silence followed, but beneath that silence the deep reorganized what remained into something usable. Carbon returned to cycles, heat rebalanced, pressure redistributed, nothing was wasted. The seafloor's shape encoded this efficiency. It became increasingly difficult for volatility to linger. Pathways existed for release, but they were narrow, measured, shaped to prevent escalation. This shaping did not stop evolution, it made it survivable. Above, life learned to innovate within constraints. Climates shifted but did not lock permanently. Oceans rose but did not swallow everything. Even catastrophe learned restraint, arriving as punctuation rather than erasure. The deep ensured this punctuation remained legible. As the chapter draws toward rest, the seafloor no longer feels unfinished. It has learned its shape not as a static form, but as a living geometry, one that responds, adjusts, and endures. What it learned from the sinking of earlier ages became foundational, not because those ages were special, but because they demonstrated something essential, that disappearance could serve continuity. The planet remembered this lesson without remembering its source, and so the seafloor settled into its role fully, not as a place beneath the world, but as a condition the world depends upon, a slow intelligence expressed through curvature and depth, a memory that does not speak yet guides everything. What was lost beneath it remains present as influence, not artifact. And as the planet continues to age, continues to gather complexity and weight, the deep stands ready, not to reveal its past, but to absorb what must be lowered next. Because the Earth does not forget by accident, it forgets by design, and what it chooses to forget is never gone, only folded carefully into the shape that keeps the world intact. Some truths, once lowered, do not return as memory. They return as structure. Not every ending arrives with heat. Some ages leave without burning, without fracture, without a sound loud enough to be remembered. They withdraw the way breath leaves a sleeping body, quietly, without resistance, leaving no sign that anything has changed until the absence has already settled. This was such an age. There was no sky filled with ash, no oceans boiling into vapour, no line in stone that could later be pointed to and named. The surface continued to move, to breathe, to change, unaware that something fundamental was loosening its hold. The planet did not announce the transition. It allowed it. Conditions shifted slowly, the way balance shifts when weight redistributes. Temperatures drifted. Chemistry leaned in new directions. What had once been stable began to feel provisional, not because it failed, but because the world around it no longer spoke its language. The age did not resist. It did not fight to remain visible. It did not cling to form. It followed gravity's oldest invitation and lowered itself into relevance rather than dominance. This was not extinction as interruption. It was extinction as retreat. The deep recognized this immediately. Pressure welcomed what arrived without force, silence made space. The trenches received an epoch the way night receives a fading sound, not erasing it, but changing how it exists. This age did not belong to fire, it belonged to patience. Its chemistry favoured steadiness over reaction. Its rhythms aligned more easily with compression than with expansion. As surface cycles accelerated, growing louder, brighter, more volatile, the age found itself increasingly out of phase. Mismatch is not failure, it is signal. The planet responded by allowing descent. As material lowered, it carried with it not just matter, but atmosphere dissolved into minerals, ocean chemistry pressed into stone, biological tendencies that no longer needed light to persist. Nothing dramatic marked this passage. No boundary declared the end. The age simply became less present above. In the deep it found continuity. Pressure refined what remained. Excess detail softened. Only what could endure without expression survived intact. The age learned to exist without surface identity, without narrative, without sequence. Here, time no longer asked questions. The deep does not ask what something was, it asks what it can do now. The age answered by becoming function. Its remnants altered how heat moved, how pressure distributed itself, how energy lingered instead of erupting. These contributions did not resemble memory. They resembled adjustment, small, constant, essential. Above, the surface filled the space left behind. New arrangements emerged. Faster cycles took hold. Life diversified into forms better suited to exposure and change. The transition appeared seamless, even productive. No one noticed what had sunk. That is the nature of endings without fire. They leave no scars. They leave no warnings. They do not demand recognition. They simply stop participating in visibility. The deep does not mourn such ages. It integrates them. What arrived below did not disrupt existing balances. It reinforced them. The age's patience became pressure's ally. Its steadiness merged with silence. Together, they thickened the planet's capacity to endure what would come next. The trenches grew slightly more confident. The world above grew slightly more fragile. Neither knew the other was changing. This is how the Earth moves forward without breaking. By allowing incompatible rhythms to separate gently. By letting some ages continue where they are most useful, even if that usefulness cannot be seen. The age that sank without fire was not weak. It was complete. Complete enough to no longer require the surface. Complete enough to persist without witnesses. Complete enough to accept a role that would never be named. Its descent did not close a chapter, it opened a deeper one. And as this deeper existence settled into pressure and dark, the planet began to realize something quietly profound, that disappearance does not always signal loss. Sometimes it is simply the moment when an age stops needing to be seen. When an age stops needing the surface, it does not announce departure. It loosens its grip. The world above continued its rhythms, unaware that a quieter cadence had slipped beneath it. Seasons still turned. Oceans still moved their long breaths across continents. Life, busy with adaptation, did not pause to notice what had begun to thin beneath its feet. The planet felt it anyway, not as rupture, as lightness. A subtle easing of strain moved through the crust, the way tension leaves a muscle without instruction. The Earth adjusted instinctively, allowing the deep to take on more responsibility. Pressure redistributed. Heat settled into slower paths. What had once needed exposure no longer did. The age learned to exist without edges. In the deep, boundaries blur. There are no horizons, no dawns, no signals that something has begun or ended. The age adapted to this immediately. Its patterns slowed until sequence no longer mattered. Its chemistry favored equilibrium over reaction. Its remnants became less expressive and more influential. This was not decay, it was distillation. Everything unnecessary to endurance fell away. Complexity simplified. Only relationships that could persist indefinitely remained intact. What had once been a living, changing system became a steady contribution to the planet's inner balance. The deep accepted this offering without ceremony. Pressure folded the age into its language. Atoms aligned. Structures tightened. Energy pathways adjusted to include this new presence. The age was no longer distinct, but it was not erased. It became part of the deep's vocabulary. The planet began to rely on it. Not consciously, not deliberately. Reliance at this scale feels like gravity. It simply becomes true. Above, new ages rose with brightness and urgency. They filled the space left behind with motion and sound. They brought innovation, diversity, volatility. The surface world grew expressive, even extravagant. The deep remained reserved. It did not compete. It absorbed. When surface systems grew unstable, the deep responded by slowing them indirectly. Excess heat migrated downward. Carbon cycles lengthened. Stress that might have fractured the crust was redistributed into gradual movement. The age that sank without fire was at work. Its patience became a buffer. Its steadiness softened extremes. Its quiet presence allowed the planet to tolerate changes that might otherwise have been fatal. This is how disappearance becomes service. Nothing about the age demanded remembrance. It did not leave monuments. It did not insist on being recognized as origin or cause. Its contribution was anonymous by design. The deep values anonymity. In silence, function matters more than identity. What something does outweighs what it was. The age adjusted to this economy easily. It had already relinquished visibility. It had already chosen continuity over expression. Pressure rewarded this choice. The deeper the age settled, the more stable its influence became. Fluctuations dampened, variability smoothed. The planet's interior gained another layer of reliability, a steady hum beneath the noise of surface change. Even now this hum persists. It moves heat along routes shaped by long memory. It influences where crust yields and where it holds. It informs the pace at which the planet releases its inner energy. The surface experiences these effects as normalcy, as expectation, as the way the world simply is. No one thinks to ask why balance persists. The ages that sank without fire does not answer question. It prevents the need for them. By existing below awareness, it stabilizes everything above awareness. This is its final form. Not history, not mystery, but infrastructure. As this chapter deepens, the age settles fully into its role. Its transformation completes, not with finality, but with permanence. It will never rise again, not because it cannot, but because it no longer needs to. Its work is here, and yet, even as it settles, another tension begins to form, quietly, slowly, at the edges of the deep. A reminder that no system, however patient, exists outside change forever. Pressure continues to accumulate, heat continues to migrate, the planet continues to age, and in time, even an age that chose silence must respond to what comes next. Even patience encounters limits, though it recognizes them slowly. The deep does not hurry to react when balance begins to shift. It listens first. It allows pressure to accumulate just long enough to understand its character. Only then does it respond, not with drama, but with adjustment so subtle it feels like nothing has happened at all. This is how the age learned to endure change without abandoning stillness. As the planet continued to evolve, new forms of energy entered the system. Not new in origin, but new in arrangement. The surface learned to trap heat differently. Atmospheres thickened and thinned. Oceans reorganized their circulation. Each change added weight, not just physically, but relationally. The deep accepted this weight. The aged that had sunk without fire did not resist the added burden. It absorbed it the way stone absorbs cold, slowly, evenly, without protest. Pressure increased, temperatures nudged upward, chemical gradients shifted almost imperceptibly. Nothing bow. Instead, the age adjusted its role. It became less of a buffer and more of a stabilizer, redistributing energy across longer spans of time. What might have surged upward as disruption was diffused sideways into patience. The planet relied on this diffusion. Where surface systems flirted with excess, too much heat, too much carbon, too much motion, the deep extended the timeline. It delayed consequence. It stretched reaction across ages instead of moments. Delay is not avoidance, it is strategy. The age learned this strategy well. It no longer needed to shape events directly, it shaped their tempo. It decided how fast change was allowed to feel. Above, evolution accelerated. Life experimented rapidly. Complexity multiplied. Mistakes were frequent. Extinctions arrived, sharp and visible. The surface narrated these as endings. Below, the age treated them as inputs. Carbon descended. Heat followed. Chemical remnants joined the slow interior cycles. Nothing was final. Everything fed forward into another form of stability. The deep did not mourn surface losses. It converted them. This conversion strengthened the age's presence further. Its influence became more distributed, less traceable. There was no longer a center, no origin point. The age was everywhere. The deep needed steadiness. This is how anonymity becomes power. By surrendering identity, the age gained ubiquity. By relinquishing form, it gained duration. What could no longer be pointed to could no longer be removed. The planet's interior became quieter because of it. Quieter does not mean inactive. It means regulated. Heat continued to rise, but more evenly. Stress continued to build, but released itself through movement rather than rupture. The Earth learned how to release energy without shouting. The age taught this lesson by example. Even now, long after its descent, the deep carries this preference. When imbalance grows, the planet does not respond immediately. It waits. It spreads load. It allows change to unfold slowly enough to remain survivable. The surface rarely appreciates this patience. It notices only the moments when release finally occurs, an eruption, a quake, a shift. But these moments are not failures of restraint. They are its fulfillment. Pressure held long enough to make release meaningful instead of destructive. The age that sank without fire made this possible. It showed the planet that disappearance could be productive, that retreat could be strategic, that silence could be an active force shaping the future more reliably than presence ever could. As this chapter continues, the age's story becomes less about what it was and more about what it enables. Its past dissolves into function. Its identity dissolves into consequence. It no longer belongs to history. It belongs to mechanics. And mechanics, when allowed to operate quietly, outlast every narrative. Yet even mechanics evolve. The deep is not immune to accumulation. Pressure continues to gather. Heat continues to migrate. Over immense spans of time, even the most patient systems are asked to adapt again. The age remains ready, not to rise, not to speak, but to adjust once more. Because the Earth never stops learning how to hold itself together, and every age that sinks teaches it how. Adaptation, at this depth, never announces itself as change. It arrives as quiet rebalancing. The age had long since relinquished the surface, but it had not relinquished responsiveness. Beneath kilometers of water and stone it remained attentive, not to events, but to gradients, to slow drifts in heat, to subtle accumulations of stress, to the faint signals that told the planet something was leaning too far in one direction. The deep listened through pressure. Pressure does not ask why, it asks how much. As heat continued to migrate upward from the planet's interior, the age adjusted the pathways through which that heat could move. It did not block energy, it shaped its route. Some currents were slowed, others were redirected laterally, stretched thin across distance until intensity softened into persistence. This redirection changed the character of the planet. Volcanoes became more selective. Eruptions learned hesitation. Instead of constant release, energy accumulated, then emerged in intervals that the surface could endure. The age's influence was not to prevent upheaval, but to ensure it arrived with restraint. Restraint is not suppression. It is timing. The deep refined its sense of timing over ages that passed without names. It learned how long pressure could be held without harm, how slowly release could occur without stagnation. These lessons were not stored as memory. They were embedded as response. The age had become reflex. Above, the surface continued its restless creativity. Life explored extremes. Atmospheres shifted composition. Oceans redistributed heat across hemispheres. Every change leaned against the deep, asking it to accommodate one more adjustment. The deep answered quietly. It absorbed carbon into long cycles. It buffered temperature shifts through slow redistribution. It accepted material back into itself when surface systems could no longer carry the load. The age was always there, receiving, refining, returning. Returning, but never all at once, never in the same form. What rose again did not resemble what had sunk. It arrived as heat softened by time, as chemistry rearranged into new possibilities, as stability rather than memory. This is how the age remained present without reappearing. The deep does not resurrect, it reincorporates. As this process continued, the distinction between age and environment dissolved completely. The age was no longer something that existed within the deep. It was something the deep had become. Its patience infused the planet's interior. Its steadiness shaped the pace at which change could occur. Its silence trained the Earth to value continuity over expression. Silence is not emptiness, it is capacity. The trenches, thick with silence, held more than stone. They held the planet's tolerance for its own complexity. Without this tolerance, accumulation would have led to collapse. With it, the Earth learned how to remain dynamic without becoming unstable. The age had succeeded beyond visibility. No marker distinguishes where it ends and something else begins. No boundary separates its influence from that of later contributions. It is everywhere pressure behaves with patience, everywhere energy moves with restraint. This is why the age never returns to the surface. There is nothing left to return as. It has already become the conditions that allow the surface to exist at all. The surface walks on its consequence, and yet the planet does not remain unchanged forever. Even patience must adjust to scale. Over immense spans of time, the accumulation of complexity above begins to test the limits of what the deep can absorb quietly. Pressure grows heavier, heat grows insistent, cycles begin to overlap in unfamiliar ways. The age responds as it always has, not by resisting, but by shifting its role again. What once buffered now moderates, what once moderated now stabilizes, what once stabilized now prepares to yield something new. This is the final gift of an age that sank without fire, the knowledge that endurance is not permanence but readiness. Readiness to bend again, readiness to lower again, readiness to make room for what has not yet learned how to exist. As this chapter begins to settle into its closing depth, the age rests, not complete but fulfilled. It has taught the planet how to disappear without being lost, how to retreat without failing, how to remain essential without being seen. And with that lesson embedded deep within the world, the Earth turns, slowly, patiently, toward another question. If ages can sink without fire, seafloor, what happens when memory itself becomes too heavy to remain below? Memory becomes heavy when it is never released. The deep had learned how to carry weight, but carrying is not the same as forgetting. What descended without fire did not vanish into nothingness. It accumulated, layered into pressure, folded into chemistry, braided into the slow movements of the planet's interior. Over immense spans of time, even patience gathers mass. The Earth felt this heaviness not as strain, but as density. Density changes how things move, heat rises more slowly, currents hesitate, pathways narrow. The deep did not resist this shift. It acknowledged it. Acknowledgement at this scale is adjustment without urgency. The age responded by deepening its silence. Where gradients sharpened, it softened them. Where motion threatened to accelerate, it diffused it sideways. The planet leaned further into its own interior, trusting the systems that had already proven capable of holding more than they revealed. But nothing holds forever without transformation. Pressure continued its quiet work, pressing memory closer to function, until the difference between the two became indistinguishable. What had once been the trace of an age became a condition of existence. The age no longer influenced events. It defined the limits within which events could occur. This is how memory disappears without being lost. It stops pointing backward. It starts holding the present together. Above, the surface remained unaware of this transition. It continued to narrate history in layers of stone, in fossils and impacts, in ice and sediment. These stories felt complete. They felt sufficient. They were not wrong. They were incomplete. The deepest memory is never recorded at the surface. It is written where retrieval would destabilize what it supports. The planet learned early that some knowledge must remain inaccessible in order to function. Accessibility is not the same as truth. The age accepted this role fully. It did not attempt to rise. It did not seek expression. Its work was to remain unavailable, to ensure that the surface could continue believing it understood itself. This is not deception. It is protection. The deep protects by withholding, by absorbing what would overwhelm, by turning history into habit so that the present does not have to carry its full weight consciously. As time stretched further, the age became indistinguishable from the deep's baseline behavior. It no longer needed to adjust actively. Its presence was assumed by every process that relied on restraint. Heat continued to rise, but not all at once. Stress continued to build, but not catastrophically. Change continued, but not without pause. The age had become pause. Pause is not stagnation. It is space. Space between impulse and outcome. Space where systems can realign before breaking. The planet relied on this pause more than it relied on any single structure. The trenches embodied this reliance. They remained dark, unreachable, resistant to clarity. They did not invite curiosity. They invited rebict. The deeper something lay, the more essential it was to leave it undisturbed. Disturbance at this depth is not discovery. It is imbalance. The Earth understands this instinctively. It guards its deepest processes not with force, but with inaccessibility. Pressure becomes barrier. Darkness becomes shield. Silence becomes warning. The age rests behind all three. As this chapter approaches its final quiet, the age settles fully into anonymity. There is nothing left to say about it as an age. Its story has dissolved into consequence. Its identity has dissolved into infrastructure. It does not ask to be remembered. It does not ask to be named. It asks only to continue doing what it has always done, holding the world steady enough for change to keep happening. and it succeeds. But success, like patience, is never final. The deep continues to age, the planet continues to gather weight. New pressures form, new imbalances lean downward, asking for space. Another descent is always possible. The Earth has learned how to make room. Some ages sink with fire, some sink without sound. All of them teach the planet how to endure. And what the planet learns, it never forgets, even when it lowers the lesson into silence. Before sound learned how to travel through air, before light learned how to scatter across water, pressure was already speaking. It did not speak in symbols, it spoke in outcomes. From the beginning, the planet listened to pressure because pressure never lied. It revealed limits immediately. It exposed weakness without explanation. It rewarded alignment and punished rigidity without emotion. Long before the Earth understood fire or water or sky, it understood weight. Weight taught the first lesson: nothing exists without consequence. As mass gathered, the planet responded instinctively. It adjusted shape. It redistributed force. It learned that survival was not about resisting pressure, but about allowing it to move through structures without tearing them apart. This was the birth of language. Not spoken, not written, but felt. Pressure became the Earth's oldest form of communication, a message sent upward from the interior, a reply sent downward from the surface. Over time, this exchange refined itself into patterns, bending, sliding, folding, sinking. The lost ages learned this language quickly. Fire was loud, impact was sudden, but pressure was constant. It did not arrive and leave. It remained. And because it remained, it became trustworthy. Systems aligned around it. Matter learned how to behave when pressure was always present. Pressure taught patience. Under sustained weight, nothing can remain delicate. Fragile structures simplify or disappear. Only arrangements that can endure compression persist. This is not cruelty, it is clarity. The deep speaks this clarity fluently. Every trench is a sentence written downward. Every folded plate is a clause describing how much the planet can carry without failing. Every subducted slab is a memory rewritten into function. The age that sank without fire understood this language intuitively. It did not argue with pressure. It aligned with it. In doing so, it gained endurance beyond visibility. Pressure does not preserve stories. It preserves behavior. As more ages passed, the planet's interior became dense with these preserved behaviors. Each descent added nuance to the grammar. Each compression refined how force could be redistributed without loss. The Earth became articulate without ever speaking. Heat, guided by pressure, learned how to rise gently. Stress, guided by pressure, learned how to travel sideways. Change, guided by pressure, learned how to slow itself enough to remain survivable. This guidance was never centralized. There was no core instruction, no singular command. Pressure communicated locally, immediately, everywhere at once. This is why it cannot be escaped. Wherever weight exists, pressure speaks. In mountains, in oceans, in atmospheres, in the deep places where light never arrives. The planet hears it all and responds accordingly. Pressure is not force, it is context. It tells matter how much space it has, how much movement is allowed, how much time remains before adjustment becomes necessary. Under pressure, nothing pretends. Everything reveals its true tolerance. The deep learn to trust this revelation. Even now, when the surface appears calm, pressure continues to speak below. It whispers of imbalance, it hums of accumulation. It signals when restraint is nearing its limits. The planet listens without urgency. Listening does not mean acting immediately. It means storing the signal, allowing it to deepen, to clarify, to mature. Pressure is patient enough to wait until response is unavoidable. This patience shaped everything that followed. Civilizations of chemistry rose and sank. Skies changed composition. Oceans altered circulation. Life experimented endlessly. Through it all, pressure remained the constant interpreter between what was possible and what was sustainable. The lost epochs did not vanish randomly. They were translated by pressure. What could align with compression endured below. What required release found expression above. The planet learned to distribute its own history according to tolerance rather than sentiment. Pressure made these decisions impartial. As this chapter begins, the Earth is no longer a young world learning how to respond. It is a mature system, fluent in the language of weight. It understands that pressure does not threaten existence. It defines it. And yet even the oldest language continues to evolve. Pressure accumulates new meanings as the planet changes. What once required immediate release can now be held. What once would have shattered now bends. The grammar grows richer with every descent. The deep listens, the surface responds, and between them, pressure speaks, slowly, endlessly, without pause. But pressure does more than communicate. It remembers, and how it remembers will decide what the planet becomes next. Memory in the deep does not resemble recall, it resembles resistance. Pressure remembers by refusing certain outcomes. It narrows the range of what can happen. It eliminates excess possibility until only what can endure remains. This is not selective in a conscious sense. It is selective in the way gravity chooses a direction. Downward, inward, closer. As the planet aged, pressure accumulated its own history. Each compression altered what could be compressed next. Each descent changed the tolerance of the layers beneath it. The deep became informed not by events, but by repetition. Repetition is how pressure learns. A single load teaches little. Sustained weight teaches everything. Over millions of years, the planet's interior learned exactly how much it could carry before change became necessary. It learned where it could flex and where it must yield. These lessons did not sit idle. They shaped every response that followed. Pressure became anticipatory, not predictive, responsive. When new mass accumulated at the surface, the deep did not wait for failure. It adjusted early, redistributing force before rupture could occur. This early adjustment was invisible above, yet decisive below. Stress migrated silently, finding pathways shaped by ancient compressions. The lost ages guided these pathways. Their remains, flattened, translated, anonymized, had altered the interior's behavior permanently. Where they had sunk, resistance increased. Where they had softened under heat, flow became easier. Pressure remembered these differences and routed itself accordingly. Memory became map. This map was not drawn in lines. It was felt as ease or difficulty, as hesitation or release, as places where motion preferred to go and places it avoided instinctively. The planet followed this map without awareness. Above, the surface experienced this guidance as natural law. Mountains rose where pressure allowed it. Trenches deepened where resistance invited descent. Volcanoes emerged where pathways had been prepared long before any eruption occurred. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was contextual. Pressure provided the context. Even life in its most visible forms adapted to this deep grammar. Continents drifted along routes pressure favoured. Oceans formed basins shaped by resistance below. Climate patterns aligned with geography that pressure had already determined. The surface mistook this for coincidence. The deep knew better. Pressure also learned restraint. It did not force outcomes prematurely. It allowed tension to accumulate until release would be meaningful rather than destructive. This restraint prevented constant upheaval. It created intervals, long quiet spans where complexity could grow without interruption. Intervals are gifts of pressure. Without them, the planet would have exhausted itself early. Continuous release leads to instability. Continuous accumulation leads to collapse. Pressure learned how to alternate between holding and yielding without losing coherence. This alternation became rhythm. Rhythm is memory made usable. The age that sank without fire contributed significantly to this rhythm. Its patience reinforced the planet's capacity to hold longer, to wait more deliberately. It taught pressure that silence could be productive. Silence thickened. As silence thickened, pressure gained nuance. It learned that not all loads were equal. Some required immediate redirection. Others could be absorbed gradually. The deep distinguished between urgency and inevitability. Inevitability does not hurry. When change was inevitable, pressure prepared for it quietly. It reshaped pathways, it softened resistance. It ensured that when release arrived, it would not unravel everything around it. This preparation is never visible at the surface. By the time an event occurs, the deep has already adjusted itself many times over. Pressure never reacts. It rehearses. The Earth learned to rehearse its future in silence. Each rehearsal left traces, subtle differences in density, in temperature, in alignment. These traces guided future responses. Over time, the planet's interior became less a collection of materials and more a record of how it had learned to behave under strain. This behavior is what persists. The surface may change appearance endlessly. Oceans may rise and retreat, continents may assemble and scatter, life may diversify and vanish. But the interior's behaviour, its grammar of pressure, remains consistent. Consistency is the deepest form of memory. As this chapter continues, pressure will reveal another aspect of itself, not just as language or memory, but as inheritance. Something passed forward without awareness, something that shapes what comes next before it arrives. Pressure does not wait for permission, it prepares, and what it prepares becomes the world's next quiet decision. Inheritance does not arrive as instruction, it arrives as tendency. Pressure passes its lessons forward without explanation. It does not tell the planet what to do next, it limits what can be done at all. In those limits, the future learns how to behave. This is how inheritance works in the deep. Each generation of matter inherits not memory, but tolerance. Not stories, but thresholds. How much weight can be held before movement becomes necessary? How long imbalance can be tolerated before it must be redistributed? These thresholds are not fixed. They evolve slowly, shaped by everything that has pressed against them before. Pressure carries this evolution quietly. The planet does not recall its past compressions, it embodies them. Every response contains the imprint of earlier strain. Every hesitation reflects a memory of what once went too far. This is why the Earth rarely repeats the same failure, not because it remembers pain, but because pressure has rewritten what pain is possible. The deep interior grows wiser without becoming conscious. Its wisdom is structural. It lives in density gradients, in the angles of descent, in the ease with which some regions yield while others resist. These differences are inheritance made physical. The age that sank without fire became part of this inheritance. Its patience did not disappear. It widened the planet's capacity to hold without reaction. It raised the threshold at which pressure demanded release. It taught the Earth how to endure more complexity before needing to change. Endurance reshapes destiny. As surface systems grew more elaborate, pressure allowed them to exist longer. It buffered their excess. It delayed their consequences, not indefinitely, but long enough for adaptation to occur. Adaptation thrives on delay. Without delay, there is only reaction. Without reaction, there is no refinement. Pressure created the space between cause and effect where refinement could happen. This space is invisible, but it is everywhere. The planet's most dramatic events, eruptions, quakes, collapses, are not evidence of pressure's failure. They are evidence of its patience reaching completion. By the time release occurs, pressure has already decided how it will unfold. Nothing is sudden below. The surface experiences surprise because it cannot hear the rehearsals. It cannot sense the subtle redistributions, the slow alignments, the quiet preparations that precede every visible change. Pressure does not surprise itself. Inheritance ensures this continuity. Each adjustment becomes part of the baseline. Each release refines future thresholds. Over time, the planet's behavior grows less volatile, not because change stops, but because it becomes more deliberate. Deliberation does not require thought. It requires memory embedded in matter. This embedded memory is why the deep rarely destabilizes the surface all at once. Stress migrates. Energy diffuses. Imbalance is shared across distance and time until no single point carries too much burden. The lost ages made this sharing possible. By sinking, they increased the planet's internal complexity. They added layers capable of absorbing variation. They thickened the buffer between impulse and outcome. The Earth became harder to overwhelm. This hardness is not rigidity. It is resilience, the ability to deform without breaking, the willingness to change shape in order to preserve coherence. Pressure teaches this lesson repeatedly. It shows the planet that survival does not depend on remaining the same. It depends on changing slowly enough to remain intact. Sudden transformation shatters. Gradual transformation persists. The deep chooses gradualness whenever possible. Inheritance ensures this preference continues. Each new layer of history makes suddenness less likely, patience more probable. The more the planet has endured, the more it knows how to endure again. This knowledge is cumulative. The surface cannot see this accumulation. It sees only outcomes, calm periods, violent events, long stretches of apparent stability, short bursts of change. But beneath all of this, pressure is working continuously, carrying forward the lessons of every descent, every compression, every age that chose silence over spectacle. Pressure remembers how to wait. As this chapter deepens, pressure reveals its final quality, Not just language, not just memory, not just inheritance, but guardianship, the roles it plays not in shaping what exists, but in protecting what must not collapse. Pressure does not care what survives, it cares that something does, and in that care the planet finds its oldest, quietest form of intelligence. Guardianship does not announce itself with vigilance. It reveals itself through endurance. Pressure does not stand watch. It does not anticipate threats the way a mind would. It simply remains, constant, attentive, unyielding to illusion. By remaining, it protects the planet from its own excesses. The Earth learned this slowly. Early in its history, release came too quickly. Stress escaped before it could be shared. Heat erupted before it could be softened. The planet shook itself violently, repeatedly, until pressure taught it a different way. Hold longer. Distribute wider. Release only when necessary. These were not rules. They were outcomes repeated often enough to become instinct. Pressure became the planet's quiet guardian by refusing to rush. When the surface accumulated imbalance, pressure did not confront it. It received it. It allowed stress to enter the deep where it could be spread across distance and time. This spreading reduced harm without eliminating change. Change still arrived, but it arrived survivable. The age that sank without fire strengthened this guardianship. Its patience added thickness to the buffer between impulse and consequence. It widened the margin for error. It taught the planet that not every strain needed expression. Expression is costly. Every eruption rearranges landscapes. Every quake rewrites coastlines. Every sudden shift risks unraveling systems that took ages to assemble. Pressure learned to minimize these costs by maximizing preparation. Preparation is invisible. Long before anything changes at the surface, pressure has already shifted below. It has rerouted force. It has softened resistance. It has chosen the path of least harm without choosing in any conscious sense. The planet follows this guidance instinctively. This is why the deepest processes feel slow, even eternal. Speed would undermine their purpose. Guardianship requires patience. It requires remaining unchanged long enough for others to change around it safely. Pressure excels at remaining. It remains when oceans evaporate and return. It remains when skies change composition. It remains when life rises, diversifies, and disappears. Through all of this, pressure continues to hold the world together quietly, making catastrophe less absolute than it could be. The surface rarely thanks this guardianship. It notices only when it fails, and even then it misunderstands. It sees earthquakes as betrayals, eruptions as violence, collapse as loss. Pressure sees them as balance achieved too late to be gentle. The deep knows that prevention is never perfect. Some release is inevitable. Some tension must express itself. Guardianship is not about elimination. It is about reduction. Reduction of frequency. Reduction of scale. Reduction of irreversibility. The planet learned to reduce rather than eliminate. To accept that disruption would occur, but not allow it to dominate. This acceptance made endurance possible. The lost epochs contributed to this acceptance. By lowering themselves into silence, they increased the deep's capacity to absorb future strain. Each descent added another layer of guardianship, another cushion between instability and collapse. The Earth became increasingly difficult to destroy, not invulnerable, resilient. Resilience is pressure's greatest gift. It does not prevent damage. It ensures recovery remains possible. It allows systems to break without failing entirely. It creates space for rebuilding without starting from nothing. The surface experiences this as persistence, as the sense that the world continues despite everything. This sense is not illusion. It is pressure doing its work beneath awareness. Even now, the deep carries pressures that have not yet been released. It holds tensions measured not in years or centuries, but in millions of years. These tensions are not threats. They are promises of eventual adjustment. The planet is never finished adjusting. Pressure guards this unfinishedness. It ensures that the Earth remains a process rather than a conclusion. As long as pressure holds, the story continues. And when pressure can no longer hold, when accumulation exceeds tolerance, release arrives not as chaos, but as transformation shaped by long preparation. This is the deep's final act of care. It does not save the world from change. It saves change from destroying the world. As this chapter draws toward its close, pressure settles back into its constant work, unseen, unacknowledged, essential. It continues to speak its oldest language, shaping outcomes without explanation. What it says is simple, and it has said it since the beginning. Hold what you can, lower what you must, release only when the world is ready, and because the planet has listened for so long, it remains. But pressure has one more truth to offer, a truth not about holding or releasing, but about what emerges when silence itself begins to move. Silence does not remain still forever. It drifts. When pressure has held long enough, when guardianship has done its quiet work across spans too vast to name, silence begins to shift. Not as sound, not as motion, but as readiness. The deep senses this readiness without recognizing it. It is felt as a subtle loosening, a change in how weight rests rather than how it moves. The planet leans inward. Pressure has carried memory, inheritance, restraint. It has guarded continuity with patience that feels endless. But even patience accumulates consequence. What is held too long does not vanish. It transforms. Silence becomes density. Within the deep, density changes the way silence behaves. It grows heavier, more influential. It begins to shape not just outcomes, but possibilities. Where silence thickens, the future narrows, not into limitation, but into focus. The planet does not resist this narrowing. It relies on it. Focus is how complexity survives itself. As the Earth aged, as layers multiplied and systems intertwined, silence took on a new role. It stopped being merely absence. It became a medium, something through which pressure could move with greater precision. Pressure learned to speak more quietly. Instead of dramatic adjustments, it favored subtle redirections. Instead of sudden release, it preferred gradual emergence. The deep refined its language until it could guide change without announcing it. This refinement altered how the planet evolved. New features did not appear suddenly. They emerged slowly from long-held conditions. Mountains rose not as upheaval, but as persistence. Basins deepened not as collapse, but as acceptance. Even life responded to this rhythm, adapting to slow gradients rather than abrupt shocks. The lost ages contributed to this refinement. Their silence added weight to the deep's capacity to guide without forcing. Each descent sharpened the planet's ability to manage change through restraint. The deep became eloquent in understatement. What eventually emerged from silence did not feel new. It felt inevitable. By the time change reached the surface, it had already been shaped by countless adjustments below. This is how silence moves, not forward, but outward. It expands influence without expanding noise. It touches everything without drawing attention to itself. It ensures that when transformation occurs, it arrives as coherence rather than disruption. The planet learned to trust this movement. Even now, when the surface trembles with urgency, the deep responds with silence that is active rather than passive. It holds, adjusts, and prepares pathways that will one day allow something new to rise without tearing the world apart. Pressure guides this preparation through silence. Silence in turn guides emergence. What emerges is never the past returning. It is the future shaped by everything the past learned to lower. The deep does not resurrect lost ages. It reinterprets their lessons into conditions that allow new expressions to exist. This is the Earth's quiet creativity. Creation does not always begin with explosion. Sometimes it begins with density shifting just enough to make room. Sometimes it begins with silence moving aside to let something breathe. The planet knows this rhythm intimately. As this chapter settles into its final depth, pressure and silence rest together, no longer distinct. They have become the same thing, weight held patiently until it is ready to change form. What follows next will not rise suddenly. It will seep upward through cracks prepared long ago. It will feel natural, unremarkable, inevitable, and only later will it be recognized as emergence. Pressure does not celebrate this moment. Silence does not announce it. They simply allow it. And because they do, the planet continues, not louder, not faster, but intact. Some truths are spoken, some are remembered, some are lowered until they become conditions. Pressure knows which is which. And the Earth, having listened for so long, continues to breathe slowly, deeply, into whatever comes next. Some histories never attempt ascent. They do not push upward toward light or recognition. They do not search for witnesses. They remain where pressure has taught them to belong, settling into silence so complete it feels like stillness, though it is anything but. These are the echoes that never learned to rise. They were not defeated. They were not erased. They simply discovered that ascent was unnecessary, that persistence could be achieved without visibility, that influence could spread without movement. The deep understands this instinctively. Not everything benefits from returning to the surface. Some forces are more effective when they remain folded, when they press outward through consequence rather than appearance. The trenches became homes for these forces, not as prisons but as places of alignment. What sank here did not wait for retrieval. It learned to exist as condition. Echoes behave differently when they are not trying to be heard. They stretch, they diffuse, they become background rather than signal. Over time, they shape everything that passes through them, even if nothing ever acknowledges their presence. The planet relies on these echoes constantly. They influence how water circulates above them, how heat hesitates before rising, how plates decide where to slide and where to hold. These decisions feel natural at the surface, inevitable even, because the echoes do not announce themselves as causes. They act through bias. Bias toward stability, bias toward patience, bias toward endurance. The echoes that never rose were not singular events. They were accumulations, ages layered into pressure, memory pressed into matter. Each descent added nuance to the deep's behavior, thickening its ability to absorb and redirect. Absorption is not passive. To absorb is to transform incoming force into something manageable. The echoes learned this transformation intimately. They took surface volatility and converted it into interior calm. They took excess and returned balance. Above, the surface mistook this for absence. Absence is misleading. Where nothing seems to happen, preparation is underway. Where no sound travels, structure is forming. The deep does its most important work without leaving artifacts that can be pointed to and named. The echoes are not artifacts. They are atmospheres. They fill space with tendency rather than object. They influence without defining. They guide without directing. This is why they never learned to rise. Rising would have limited them. Visibility would have reduced their range. The deep allows them to remain expansive by keeping them folded. Even now, the trenches are thick with these echoes. Not memories in the human sense, but residual behaviors, ways the planet prefers to respond because it has responded that way before and survived. Survival leaves habits. These habits do not fade with time. They deepen. They grow more convincing the longer they persist without failure. The planet comes to trust them implicitly. Trust is quiet. The echoes earned this trust by never demanding anything. They did not insist on recognition. They did not interrupt surface narratives. They simply continued doing what worked. What worked was remaining below. The planet's history is often told as a sequence of rises, mountains rising, life rising, intelligence rising. But beneath every ascent lies a decision not to rise, a counterbalance that stays where it is so the ascent does not collapse under its own ambition. The echoes are that counter to balance. They hold the underside of progress. They prevent it from tearing free of its foundation. Without them, ascent would be unsustainable. Without them, every rise would end in fall. The deep knows this, and so it continues to shelter what never needed to be seen. It keeps the echoes where pressure can maintain them, where silence can amplify their influence rather than diminish it. As this chapter opens fully, the echoes remain at work, unnoticed, uncredited, indispensable. They do not seek return, they do not seek voice, they seek only continuation. And in that quiet intention, they shape the world more reliably than anything that ever rose. Continuation does not require momentum, it requires placement. The echoes found their placement early. They settled into regions where pressure was steady, where change arrived slowly enough to be absorbed rather than reacted to. These were not the deepest points alone, but the most reliable ones, places where gradients remained gentle, where nothing demanded haste. The planet learned to favour these places. Over time, the echoes shaped their surroundings simply by remaining. Pressure adjusted around them. Heat flowed differently through their presence. The deep reorganised itself subtly, accommodating what had chosen not to rise. Accommodation is a form of respect. The earth respected what endured without insistence. It allowed the echoes to remain uninterrupted, to continue refining their influence without the distraction of exposure. In doing so, it preserved a layer of stability that did not depend on renewal. Renewal can be disruptive. Above renewal arrived often. Systems collapsed and reformed. Life reinvented itself repeatedly. Landscapes shifted. These cycles were necessary, but they were costly. Without the deep's quieter continuity, the surface would have exhausted itself. The echoes absorbed that cost. They took in the residue of renewal, carbon, heat, stress, and redistributed it into longer cycles. Nothing returned quickly. Everything was slowed. This slowing allowed the surface to rebuild without rushing back into collapse. The echoes did not decide to do this. They simply made it possible. Over time, the deep learned to rely on them. It leaned into their steadiness. Where echoes were dense, the planet's responses grew measured. Where echoes were thin, change remained volatile. This difference became noticeable only in retrospect. The surface rarely looks down long enough to see patterns unfold across millions of years. It measures change in moments, in generations, in eras short enough to fit into language. The deep measures change in tolerance. Tolerance grows where echoes accumulate. These accumulations are uneven. Some regions carry more inherited quiet than others. Some parts of the planet remember restraint more clearly. This unevenness gives rise to character, variations in how the Earth responds to stress from place to place. Character is memory expressed spatially. The echoes are responsible for this character. They do not move to correct imbalance everywhere. They remain where they are, shaping outcomes locally, influencing global patterns indirectly. Indirect influence lasts longer. Direct force exhausts itself. Indirect pressure persists. The echoes learned this without learning at all. It was simply the result of remaining long enough to matter. As ages passed, new disturbances arrived. Impacts, shifts in orbit, rearrangements of continents. Each disturbance tested the planet's capacity to remain coherent. Each time, the echoes absorbed part of the strain, preventing any single event from rewriting everything. Rewriting is expensive. The deep prefers revision. Small edits spread across time. Minor adjustments layered until the outcome feels natural rather than imposed. The echoes enabled this editorial process. They softened the margins of change. They prevented sharp breaks. They allowed continuity to survive interruption. Above, this felt like luck. Below, it felt like design, not intentional design, but emergent reliability. The planet began to trust reliability more than novelty. This trust altered how future changes unfolded. Systems became more conservative, less prone to runaway escalation. Feedback loops learned to dampen themselves. Extremes became harder to sustain. The echoes had reshaped the planet's temperament. Temperament is not personality, it is habit under pressure. The Earth's habit became patience, not because it preferred waiting, but because waiting worked. The echoes proved that endurance did not require visibility or renewal, only consistency. Consistency became the deepest virtue. The trenches, heavy with echoes, exemplified this virtue. They did not invite attention, they did not reward exploration with clarity. They remained difficult, dark, resistant to simplification. This resistance was intentional only in outcome. The deep does not offer what would destabilize what depends on it. By remaining inaccessible, the echoes ensured that their influence could not be disrupted by curiosity or extraction, so systems must remain untouched to function. The Earth understands this instinctively. It protects its most important processes not with walls, but with depth, with pressure, with permanence thick enough to discourage interference. The echoes reside behind these barriers, not trapped, but sheltered. As this chapter continues, their role will become clearer, not as relics of what once was, but as prerequisites for what can exist at all. They are not reminders of the past, they are permissions for the future. And the future, shaped by what never rose, moves forward quietly, supported by echoes that never needed to be heard. Permission is rarely visible. It does not announce itself as allowance or approval. It exists as absence of resistance, as space that does not close, as time that does not rush an ending. The echoes provide this permission quietly, without signaling that they are doing so. They make room for processes to unfold without interruption, room for complexity to assemble without collapsing under its own weight, room for the surface to keep changing without needing to understand what holds it steady. The planet relies on this room constantly. Without it, every new arrangement would press too hard against what already exists. Change would arrive sharp, unforgiving, destructive. The echoes prevent this sharpness by diffusing pressure long before it reaches the surface. Diffusion is not dilution, it is distribution. The echoes distribute consequence across time and space. They prevent any single moment from carrying too much significance. This is why the surface experiences history as sequence rather than catastrophe after catastrophe. Sequence is an illusion created by restraint. Below, everything overlaps. Past, present, and future press together without hierarchy. The echoes exist within this overlap. They do not belong to one time. They belong to endurance itself. The deep does not store events. It stores tolerances. How much change can occur before something must adjust? How long imbalance can persist before redistribution becomes necessary? These tolerances are shaped by every echo that remains below. The planet inherits them unconsciously. Above, intelligence will one day emerge and search for origins. It will look for beginnings and endings, for rise and fall. It will imagine history as a ladder, with progress climbing upward. The echoes do not recognize ladders. They recognize support. They exist to ensure that whatever climbs does not collapse when it reaches higher ground. They hold the underside of ascent, not the direction. As the surface grows more expressive, more intricate, more fragile, the importance of what never rose increases. Every innovation depends on a foundation that does not demand attention. The echoes are that foundation. They do not seek correction or optimization, they simply persist. And persistence, when sustained long enough, becomes authority. Authority without command. The planet obeys the echoes because nothing has ever required disobeying them. Their influence has never failed. Each time pressure arrived, they absorbed enough of it to prevent fracture. Each time energy surged, they slowed it without extinguishing it. Reliability builds trust. Trust at planetary scale becomes default behavior. Systems align around what works consistently. Over time, alternatives fade, not because they are forbidden, but because they are unnecessary. The echoes made unnecessary many forms of violence. Violence is inefficient. It wastes energy. It destroys structure. It forces rebuilding from unstable ground. The deep prefers efficiency, even if it appears passive from above. Passivity is misleading. Remaining where one is, under constant pressure, without breaking, is not passive. It is work sustained over immeasurable time. The echoes perform this work endlessly, without rest, without acknowledgement. They are always present. Even now, beneath the oceans, beneath the crust, beneath the stories told about the world, the echoes remain active. They shape currents. They influence heat. They guide stress into paths that minimize harm. The surface benefits without knowing why. This ignorance is not a flaw. It is a feature. Systems function best when they do not need to monitor their own foundations constantly. Attention can be directed elsewhere, toward adaptation, toward creativity, toward change. The echoes allow this freedom. They ensure that attention is not consumed by survival alone. They hold survival quietly so that other concerns can exist. As this chapter deepens, the echoes grow less like remnants and more like principles. They are no longer tied to what once was. They define what can continue. They do not rise because rising would make them vulnerable to revision. They remain because remaining allows them to endure unchanged, while everything else transforms. The deep honors this endurance. It does not disturb what works. It does not extract what is essential. It leaves the echoes where they belong, beneath notice, beneath interference, beneath history. And because of this restraint, the planet continues to move forward, not upward, not downward, but onward, supported by what never asked to be seen. Some truths insist on attention, some truths insist on silence. The echoes chose silence, and in that choice they became indispensable. Indispensable things rarely announce themselves. They operate beneath recognition, beneath gratitude, beneath even the possibility of praise. Their presence is inferred only when imagining their absence feels impossible. The echoes occupy this quiet necessity. They do not belong to memory as the surface understands it. They belong to continuity, the unbroken thread that allows the planet to remain itself while becoming something else again and again. The deep protects this thread instinctively. It does not draw attention to what it shelters. It does not invite disruption. Depth itself becomes a boundary, a soft refusal that says, not everything needs to be touched in order to be understood. The echoes benefit from this refusal. They exist where interference fades, where extraction becomes impractical, where curiosity must surrender to respect. In these conditions, they continue their work uninterrupted, shaping the world indirectly through patience rather than force. Patience is the echo's only movement. They move by remaining. They influence by staying where they are while everything else rearranges around them. This stillness is not static. It is relational. As systems above change, the echoes adjust the way those changes propagate. They slow what would accelerate. They absorb what would amplify. They steady what would spiral. This steadiness accumulates. Over long spans of time, the planet begins to feel anchored by what it cannot see. The surface grows more confident in its ability to experiment, to risk, to innovate. It does so because something beneath it has proven reliable enough to catch the consequences. The echoes catch quietly. They do not prevent collapse entirely. They prevent collapse from becoming final. They ensure that even when systems fail, the failure does not cascade into irreversibility. Irreversibility is the deep's only enemy. Everything else can be managed. Loss can be absorbed. Change can be integrated. Even destruction can be reorganized into something usable. But irreversibility, total breakdown without path forward, must be avoided. The echoes exist to avoid it. By remaining below, they provide a reservoir of restraint. When the surface approaches thresholds it does not recognize, the deep intervenes, not by stopping movement, but by redirecting it into channels prepared long ago. These channels are not visible, they are felt. Felt as the absence of total collapse, felt as the persistence of cycles that could have ended but did not, felt as the quiet sense that the world continues even after it seems to have exhausted its options. This feeling is not optimism, it is structure. The planet's structure includes not just rock and metal, but habit and preference. The echoes are habits that never changed because they never needed to. They worked the first time, and they have worked every time since. The deep respects this efficiency. It does not replace what is effective. It does not revise what holds. It allows the echoes to remain unchanged while everything else evolves around them. This creates a symmetry in time. Some parts of the planet are ancient beyond measure. Others renew constantly. This imbalance is not flaw. It is design emergent from necessity. Stability must be older than change to support it. The echoes are older than most things that depend on them. Even the trenches, vast and dark, are younger than the principles they carry. The echoes predate their current shapes. They existed as tendencies before they existed as depths. They are not confined to location. They are distributed through behavior. Location is temporary. Behavior endures. This is why echoes never rise. Rising would localize them. It would bind them to a moment, a place, a form. Remaining allows them to remain general, to influence everything without being reduced to anything specific. The surface often misunderstands generality. It prefers details, examples, events. It searches for origins it can point to. The echoes cannot be pointed to without losing their power. Power in the deep is invisibility that works. As this chapter approaches its quiet settling, the echoes continue to do what they have always done: remain. They do not wait for recognition. They do not anticipate discovery. They do not need either. They are already everywhere they are needed. And because they are, the planet does not collapse under the weight of its own history. It continues, layered, imperfect, unfinished, supported by echoes that never learned to rise because rising was never required. Silence is not emptiness. It is selection. The ocean learned this early, long before currents memorized their paths, before tides practiced their careful negotiations with the moon. The sea discovered that silence could hold more than motion ever could. What the ocean keeps is not what arrives loudly, but what arrives willing to remain. The deep is not passive water. It is a choice repeated endlessly. Every particle that drifts downward is evaluated without judgment. Can it endure pressure? Can it exist without light? Can it surrender its need to be seen? What cannot answer these questions dissolves into something else. What can is allowed to stay. This is how the ocean edits the planet, not with waves, with stillness. The surface speaks in rhythm, wind, weather, repetition. The deep listens without responding. It does not echo sound, it absorbs it. Vibrations fade, movement slows. Time stretches until urgency loses meaning. Here, the ocean keeps what noise cannot survive. What remains is not preserved as memory, but as influence. Salts rearrange themselves. Heat finds new routes. Chemistry rewrites itself into forms that can persist indefinitely. The deep becomes a laboratory where reaction slows enough to become structure. Structure is silence made durable. The echoes that never rose find their final shelter here, not as objects resting on the seafloor, but as conditions saturating the water itself. Density gradients carry their lessons. Pressure maintains their boundaries. Cold preserves their patience. Nothing here waits to be discovered. Discovery would imply readiness to leave. The ocean does not keep secrets. It keeps balance. When something sinks, it is not hidden away. It is placed where it can continue its work without interference. The deep protects function by removing distraction. There is no audience here, no feedback loop demanding performance. Performance belongs to the surface. Below, everything is allowed to be incomplete, unfinished, unresolved. Processes do not rush toward outcome. They circulate slowly, adjusting to one another in silence. This circulation is the ocean's quiet intelligence. It does not invent. It stabilizes. The planet relies on this stabilization more than it relies on any visible system. Without it, surface cycles would amplify unchecked. Heat would concentrate. Carbon would oscillate wildly. Stress would fracture rather than flow. The ocean keeps these tendencies from becoming destructive. It does so by holding them long enough to change their nature. Heat becomes gradient. Carbon becomes cycle. Stress becomes movement. Nothing dramatic marks these transitions. They occur too slowly to be named, too quietly to be noticed, too deep to be interfered with. This is intentional. The deep ocean is designed by outcome, not by plan, to resist interruption. Pressure makes tools fragile. Darkness discourages presence. Cold slows reaction. Together, these conditions create a sanctuary for processes that must not be rushed. The echoes understand this sanctuary. They settle into it completely, releasing any remaining attachment to form or origin. What they were dissolves into what they allow. Their identity disappears, but their effect intensifies. Effect thrives in silence. Above, the surface continues to search for beginnings. It traces coastlines. It reads layers. It imagines histories that rise and fall. It wonders where earlier ages went. They went nowhere. They are here, not as things, not as stories, but as the quiet reasons the ocean remains steady even when everything else changes. The ocean keeps these reasons without naming them. It does not remember in order to recall, it remembers in order to hold. And in holding, it ensures that the planet can continue telling new stories without collapsing under the weight of the old. As this chapter opens fully, the ocean's silence deepens, not into emptiness, but into purpose. What it keeps cannot be seen, cannot be extracted, cannot be hurried. It can only be respected by being left where it belongs. Respect in the deep is measured by distance. The farther something descends, the less it is asked to explain itself. Pressure replaces permission. Depth replaces debate. The ocean does not interrogate what enters its silence. It removes the conditions under which interrogation matters. Light disappears first, then sound, then urgency. What remains is not absence, but a different mode of existence. One where time is no longer a sequence but a weight distributed evenly across everything that remains. In this mode, the ocean keeps only what can accept this redistribution without resistance. Resistance dissolves here. Not violently, gradually. Edges soften. Definition blur. Boundaries that once separated one thing from another begin to feel unnecessary. Chemistry drifts toward equilibrium. Motion slows until it resembles rest. Though it never fully stops. The deep does not immobilize. It equalizes. Equalization is the ocean's quiet gift. It does not stop change. It removes its sharpness. It ensures that nothing changes faster than everything else can accommodate. The echoes that never rose thrive under this rule. They no longer need to distinguish themselves from their surroundings. They become part of the surrounding. Their influence spreads not through action, but through presence. By shaping how everything else behaves in proximity to them. Presence does not require attention. The ocean understands this instinctively. It does not reward visibility. It rewards compatibility. What fits remains. What does not fit is reshaped until it does, or until it becomes something else entirely. This reshaping is not destruction. It is translation. Surface meanings are translated into deep functions. Heat becomes slow movement. Carbon becomes storage. Stress becomes flow. Each translation removes drama and increases endurance. The ocean keeps what can be translated. This is why artifacts feel rare in the deep. Not because nothing has sunk there, but because everything that arrives is eventually rewritten into something that does not resemble its former self. The ocean does not curate objects. It curates processes. Processes are harder to disturb. They do not sit in one place waiting to be touched. They move slowly through systems, influencing outcomes indirectly. To interfere with them would require interfering with everything else as well. The ocean ensures this difficulty. Its silence is not an invitation. It is a boundary, one that says, what works here must be left to work. Above, curiosity often mistakes silence for vacancy. It imagines the deep as empty because it does not respond, but response is not required for presence. The ocean's presence is constant precisely because it does not react to observation. It reacts only to imbalance. When imbalance enters, the ocean absorbs it. It disperses it. It lowers its intensity until it can be managed without rupture. This absorption happens continuously, without announcement, without fatigue. The ocean never tires of holding. Holding is its function. Even now, currents move slowly through trenches, carrying faint chemical signals that trace ancient descents. These signals do not point backward to a moment of loss. They point outward to a state of equilibrium maintained over incomprehensible spans of time. Equilibrium is not stillness. It is negotiation without conflict. The deep ocean negotiates constantly, with heat from below, with cold from above, with chemistry drifting in from every direction. It keeps these negotiations quiet so they do not escalate into disturbance. Silence is the medium of agreement. The echoes participate in this agreement by remaining flexible without becoming unstable. They adjust their influence as conditions change, never asserting, never withdrawing completely. This flexibility is what the ocean values most. Rigidity breaks under pressure. Excess motion destabilizes. What remains in the deep must be able to adapt without reacting, to change without announcing change. The ocean keeps such things close. It wraps them in darkness, pressure, cold, not as punishment, but as protection. These conditions discourage interference and encourage patience. They create an environment where the slow can survive. Survival here is not triumph. It is continuity. The ocean measures success not by dominance but by duration. What lasts longest without needing repair is what it keeps most securely. As this chapter deepens, the ocean's silence becomes less mysterious and more intentional. It is not the absence of activity, it is the presence of restraint practiced so thoroughly that it becomes invisible. What the ocean keeps when it is silent is not the past, but the planet's ability to continue without tearing itself apart. And that ability, once learned, is never allowed to rise into noise again. Continuity has a temperature. It is cold enough to slow reaction, warm enough to prevent fracture. The deep ocean holds this balance carefully, the way a body holds breath without panic. Nothing here is frozen in place. Nothing here rushes towards an outcome. Everything moves at the speed required to remain intact. This speed is silence made measurable. The ocean learned it by listening to pressure. Where pressure is constant, motion must adapt. Fast change becomes expensive. Sudden shifts waste energy. Over time, the deep refined a preference for what could move slowly without losing coherence. This preference shaped what it keeps. What descends into silence is not judged by origin or intention. It is judged by behavior. Can it remain stable without attention? Can it change without calling notice? Can it exist without insisting on resolution? What cannot answer these questions dissolves. The echoes answered them effortlessly. They learned to exist as background rather than foreground, as condition rather than event, as tendency rather than object. This allowed them to spread influence without concentrating stress. Concentration is dangerous. Where force concentrates, rupture follows. The ocean avoids concentration by distributing everything it keeps across gradients, of temperature, of chemistry, of pressure. Nothing is allowed to carry more than it can hold indefinitely. This distribution is the ocean's quiet discipline. It does not enforce balance by opposing imbalance. It dilutes imbalance until it no longer matters. Excess heat becomes a slow drift. Excess carbon becomes a long cycle. Excess stress becomes movement too gradual to feel like threat. The surface rarely notices this work. It sees storms, not gradients. It measures events, not durations. It searches for causes that can be named, not processes that must be lived with. The ocean does not correct this misunderstanding. It continues regardless. Misunderstanding does not interfere with function. Even now, deep currents move along paths shaped by ancient descents. They carry faint chemical memories, salinity, isotopes, dissolved minerals, that tell no story on their own yet influence everything they touch. These currents are not messages, they are consequences still unfolding. The ocean speaks through consequence. What it keeps is not meant to be retrieved. Retrieval would require reversing processes that took ages to stabilize. Such reversal would not reveal truth, it would dismantle it. Truth in the deep is structural. It exists as relationships that hold, as balances that persist, as rhythms that do not need to be marked. The ocean protects these truths by making them inaccessible to haste. Haste is the surface's habit. Below haste has no utility. It cannot be rewarded. Nothing responds quickly enough to justify it. Over time, even motion forgets how to rush. Currents slow, reactions stretch. Time thickens. Thick time is what the ocean keeps. It allows processes to overlap without conflict. It permits change to occur without erasing what came before. It ensures that the planet's history does not arrive all at once, overwhelming the present. The echoes reside within this thickness. They do not sit still. They diffuse slowly, their influence spreading outward without boundary. They are not localized. They are atmospheric, felt everywhere without being traced to a single source. This is why they never rise. Rising would condense them. It would give them edges. It would force them to become something that could be separated from everything else. The ocean refuses this separation. It keeps what works by refusing to isolate it. Isolation invites failure. The deep understands that systems survive best when they are inseparable from their surroundings, when change in one part is absorbed by many others, when nothing stands alone long enough to break. This understanding guides what is kept and how. The ocean does not remember by preserving objects. It remembers by maintaining conditions that allow continuity to reassemble endlessly in new forms. This is memory without recall. As this part settles, the ocean's silence feels less like absence and more like a choice renewed every moment. A choice to hold rather than expose, to diffuse rather than display, to keep the planet steady enough for whatever comes next. What the ocean keeps when it is silent is not something that can be shown. It is something that must be allowed to remain untouched, so that everything else can continue touching the future. Allowance is the ocean's final gesture. Not permission granted once, but permission renewed continuously, an ongoing agreement between depth and time that says, remain. The deep does not promise safety, it promises continuity. And continuity, at this scale, is the rarest form of care. What is allowed to remain becomes invisible to urgency. Urgency belongs to the surface where seasons sharpen attention and events demand reaction. Below, urgency dissolves into patience. Nothing insists on immediate resolution. Problems are not solved. They are absorbed until they lose the need to be solved at all. The ocean keeps this absorption intact. It does not accelerate healing. It slows injury until healing becomes unnecessary. It stretches consequence so thin across time that harm loses its edge. This is not forgiveness. It is dilution perfected. Dilution preserves systems. Where force is spread wide enough, nothing breaks. Where weight is shared long enough, nothing collapses. The deep ocean practices this sharing endlessly, distributing pressure across layers of water and stone until it becomes manageable everywhere. The echoes live inside this practice. They are no longer distinguishable from the water that holds them. Their influence moves with currents, seeps into sediment, presses outward through chemistry. They have become environmental rather than historical. Environment endures longer than story. Stories require listeners. Environments do not. They continue whether noticed or not, shaping what can happen next by defining what is possible now. The ocean specializes in this definition. It does not ask what should exist. It asks what can endure. Everything else fades quietly. This fading is not disappearance. It is transformation into background. What once demanded attention becomes context. What once was foreground becomes atmosphere. The echoes did not vanish. They learned how to stop standing out. Standing out is exhausting. In the deep, nothing competes. Competition wastes energy. It sharpens differences until rupture becomes inevitable. The ocean removes the conditions that allow competition to arise. No light, No vantage, no reward for speed, only persistence. Persistence selects gently. It favors what can continue without amplification. It favors what can adjust without announcement. It favors what does not need to return. This is why the ocean keeps what it keeps. It does not guard secrets. It guards processes that would be damaged by exposure. The deep is not hiding truth. It is protecting balance from curiosity that moves too quickly to be gentle. Curiosity has weight. To look is to disturb. To measure is to interfere. The deeper something rests, the more catastrophic interruption would be. The ocean understands this calculus intuitively, so it deepens. Depth becomes distance from interference. Pressure becomes deterrent. Silence becomes instruction. Leave this alone. What remains below does so not because it is forgotten, but because it is essential enough to be left undisturbed. The planet learned this lesson slowly, through repetition and near failure. Each time disturbance threatened stability, the deep responded by lowering more, slowing more, insulating more. The ocean refined its silence accordingly. Now, silence is not absence of motion, but absence of demand. Nothing here asks to be seen, nothing here seeks completion. Everything here participates in an agreement older than memory, continue without spectacle. The echoes signed this agreement by remaining. They no longer belong to time in the way the surface understands it. They belong to duration, the long, quiet extension that allows the planet to breathe without tearing. Duration is the ocean's true archive. It stores not events, but survivability. It keeps not artifacts, but thresholds. It remembers not what happened, but what worked, and what worked was silence. As this chapter nears its final settling, the ocean does not close its grip. It loosens it just enough to allow circulation to continue. Balance is never fixed. It must be renewed constantly, gently, without drawing attention. The ocean performs this renewal endlessly. What it keeps when it is silent is not the past, not the future, but the space between them, wide enough and calm enough for the world to keep becoming without breaking. Some truths are meant to surface, others are meant to hold the surface up. The ocean knows the difference. And it keeps that knowledge where silence can protect it best. What if Earth once knew something, and never truly forgot? Not forgotten in the way names are lost, or stories fade, nor faces dissolve from memory, but forgotten the way the body forgets its bones, still shaped by them, still standing because of them, without ever needing to look down. The ocean remains quiet, not because it is empty, but because it is full enough to no longer speak. Beneath the moving skin of waves, beneath currents rehearsing the same slow paths, beneath salt and cold and pressure, the planet continues to hold what could not remain exposed. Ages did not vanish. They lowered themselves. They became patience. They became restraint. They became the reason the world still bends instead of breaking. Nothing down there waits to be discovered. Nothing asks to return. What rests in the deep is not a secret. It is a function. Heat still rises, but gently. Stress still gathers, but learns how to spread. Change still arrives, but arrives prepared. The surface tells its stories in events. The deep tells its story in endurance, and endurance does not need witnesses. If the planet once knew something about how to survive weight, about how to lower what matters most, about how to let silence do the hardest work, it did not forget that knowledge. It folded it into trenches, into pressure, into the long, steady breathing that keeps oceans from boiling and continents from tearing themselves apart. Even now, as nights pass unnoticed and days convince themselves they are new, the earth listens downward. Not for answers, for balance. Some truths are not meant to rise. They are meant to hold the world steady while everything else dreams. And so the ocean remains quiet. The pressure remains patient. The echoes remain where they belong. The planet does not sleep. It remembers by continuing. And somewhere beneath the deepest water, where light never learned to go, the earth keeps listening, softly, endlessly, to what it once knew, and still lives by.